Omar Barghouti, you know probably, is the founder of the BDS campaign, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, one of the founders. And Ina Michaeli, here on my right, is the coordinator of the Coalition of Women for Peace from Israel. And myself, my name is Mirjam van Reisen, and I'm a professor on the Marga Klompé chair on international social responsibility. And I welcome you here also on behalf of my colleague who's somewhere there, Fadi Hirzalla from the University of Amsterdam, political scientist, and also working at the University of Utrecht and on the board of the Dutch Institute Palestine Israel. I also would like to thank ICO for their support to this evening, and I also would like to thank the Balie for hosting this debate and for not shying away from any debate or from any controversial issue. And thank you for that hand and for that applause, because I think that one of the things that as Dutch people we are proud of is that we speak our minds, that we treasure the right to free speech, and it is very much in that spirit that I hope that tonight we will debate and carry out this debate. So with that, again, I would really like to welcome all of you. I urge you to also feel free to participate in the debate after the opening statements. I will open up the floor. There are microphones. It's important that you speak in the microphones because Icon is also here to record this debate for the radio. So it's important that you speak in the phone when you do. If you show your hands, if you like to intervene, and please, if you can make the comments you like to make, but also make them short or ask questions, or of course state your disagreement or agreement with what has been said. But well, as rules of the debate, I would like to ask that everybody listens to each other's arguments and that we speak tonight here with respect, without interruptions, that the interventions are short. And also I'd like to ask you to give your name first when you speak. And the last thing on that is, in order to make sure that we have an intelligible debate, sometimes I'll just cluster the questions so that we can go subject by subject through some of the questions where that will help us. But we'll make sure that all the questions and comments will be addressed during the debate. Well, today's debate is on BDS, Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions, to discuss whether or not BDS is the right strategy to promote human rights for Palestinians and Israelis, and whether it will contribute or not to bring a resolution to flagrant human rights abuses in the region. After the debate, you are welcome to buy Omar Barghouti's book. He's the author of this book on BDS. It's available here next to this hall. To inform yourself further on the presentations and the debates the presentation that has been given and the debate that takes place. And Omar is also available to sign your copy if you so wish.
Thank you. I was asked to speak straight to the microphone. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't need this.
But we can't see you.
That's okay, as long as you can see the slides. Nothing to see here. Let me start with a question. If I can see a show of hands, how many people in this room object to this line? All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Anyone objects to this in the room? I didn't think so. Okay, good. It's good to start with that. I'll come back to this. So my presentation will be about boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and I'll specifically focus on the legacy of Martin Luther King and Mandela, sometimes explicitly, sometimes very implicitly. But this will be with us in the discussion. Martin Luther King famously said, "The deep rumbling of discontent that we hear today is the thunder of disinherited masses rising from dungeons of oppression to the bright hills of freedom. In one majestic chorus, the rising masses singing, 'Ain't gonna let nobody turn us around.'" This is the moment that we feel we're going through in the BDS movement. We're at the point where no one will be able to push us to turn around. And Nelson Mandela famously said, "Our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." Just a little history, because I'm not assuming that people necessarily know, just very relevant history. If we look at the map on your left, that's pre-1948, before Israel was established. So that's historic Palestine, I'll call it, which was British Mandate Palestine. The next map is the 1947 UN partition plan, with the green parts designated for the Arab state, and the white parts designated for the Jewish state. And of course, both Arab state and Jewish state were used as terms to describe the majorities in those states, not the ethnic makeup necessarily of the entire state. So even though there would be a Jewish state and an Arab state, neither could discriminate against others. Neither can expel others, for example. In 1948, basically, we see the third map. Israel established itself on the entire white area, expelling in the process the majority of the Palestinian people, who were ethnically cleansed, forcibly removed, into many countries, and also into the West Bank and Gaza. And then what we see today is the patches of green separated by white parts, which are Jewish colonies, Jewish-only settlements in the occupied territories of the West Bank. And we see Gaza, of course. So this is the reality today, and that's where we were before 1948, just to get an idea of the geography of the place. Now about the demography a bit, about the Palestinian population specifically. The Palestinian Bureau of Census has given us the latest details on the size of the Palestinian population. Now we have 11.22 million Palestinians at the end of 2011. 50% of them live outside of historic Palestine, which is Israel, West Bank, Gaza. 50%, half the Palestinian people live outside of historic Palestine. 37 to 38% live in the occupied Palestinian territory, which is the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. And 12%, the forgotten Palestinians, are Palestinian citizens of Israel. There's about 1.34 million Palestinians who are citizens of the State of Israel, who were not ethnically cleansed outside of the country. More than 300,000 of those were ethnically cleansed within the country. So they're Israeli citizens, but they're internally displaced persons, IDPs, which means they can't go back to their villages from which they were ethnically cleansed, although they're Israeli citizens, because they're the wrong type. So, in a nutshell, we have 37 to 38% of the Palestinians are in the occupied territories, and 62 to 63% are outside the occupied territories. So when the BDS call came out from Palestinian civil society on 9 July 2005, we called for the 3 basic rights of the entire Palestinian population. The first right, ending the occupation of 1967, the occupied territory. The second is ending the racial discrimination system, which is a form of apartheid, and I'll come back to that, inside Israel itself. So even if you end the occupation, you still have 2 other issues that are unresolved, which is the rights of Palestinian citizens in Israel to full equality under the law. And the third and most important of the 3 BDS goals, the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Now it's the most important simply in sheer numbers. The great majority of the Palestinian people are refugees. Even the 37-38% who live in the occupied territory, 42% of those are refugees. So 44%. So almost half the occupied Palestinian territory population are refugees. So overall, refugees make up almost 2/3 of the Palestinian people, the most important constituency. So BDS calls for the 3 UN-sanctioned rights of the 3 parts of the Palestinian people. And the main philosophy is that moral right will ultimately prevail over military might. BDS came out in 2005, 1 year after the International Court of Justice here in The Hague called the Israeli wall built on occupied territories illegal. A year after the ICJ ruling against the wall, Palestinian civil society saw that the international community, so-called international community, under the hegemony of the US, was unable, unwilling, or both, to do anything about Israel's violations of international law. They couldn't even stop Israel from constructing the wall, let alone ending occupation, ending apartheid, and the right of return. So Palestinian civil society resorted to the good old tactic of inviting international solidarity in the form of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, as was done in South Africa. So BDS was based a lot on Palestinian history and heritage of civil, nonviolent resistance, as well as the South African experience. And the BDS movement, which is a global movement, is today led by the Boycott National Committee, the BNC, which is the largest coalition in Palestinian civil society today. It has organizations, unions, political parties representing Palestinians in the occupied territories, West Bank, Gaza, inside Israel, as well as Palestinians in exile. So self-determination for the Palestinian people means, at the very least, at a minimum, ending all 3 forms of Israeli injustice: occupation, apartheid, and denial of refugee rights. 1967, the occupied territory, that's the most important aspect in international politics today that's spoken about. And there are many forms of Israel's infringements of international law and human rights in the occupied territories. You know that the most, so I won't talk much about it. From the siege of Gaza and the massacre committed in Gaza, end of 2008, early 2009, to the settlements building and denial of freedom of movement and freedom of religious practice and so on and so forth, to the very racist expressions of the occupation, as in Hebron, with this wall having graffiti that says Arabs to the gas chambers. And of course, this issue about racism has become prevalent in Israeli society lately. Anyone who's been to Israel or is in touch with Israel would know that racism is on the rise to a very alarming degree. Israeli army platoons pride themselves who designs the most offensive, abrasive t-shirt. And one of the t-shirts that came out, which was quite popular, has a Palestinian woman who's pregnant and a crosshair on her belly, and it says 1 shot, 2 kills. And of course, during the attack on Gaza, with the white phosphorus showers on a UN shelter, a school used as shelter during the Gaza aggression. These are just manifestations of the occupation. And of course, water denial of access to water, as Amnesty International said in an excellent report that they issued called Thirsting for Justice, that Israel denies water to the Palestinians as a means of expulsion, to expel Palestinians from the so-called Area C. The West Bank is divided into Area A, B, and C, with C being the largest reserves of land and water resources, the aquifers. So Israel, to push people out of those areas, prevents them from digging wells, from extracting rainwater, from collecting rainwater, from doing anything with water. Israel controls the entire water infrastructure. Even if you have rain falling on your land and you try to collect the rainwater, which is a habit Palestinian farmers have done for hundreds and hundreds of years, it's illegal. You cannot collect rainwater falling on your land because it's not yours. And of course, using Palestinians, especially children, as human shields, which was quite well documented by Amnesty and even some Israeli human rights organizations like bestseller. And the famous, or infamous, wall, I should say. Now, inside Israel itself, within the 1948 territory. A form of apartheid has existed since the existence of the State of Israel. And this is not a term we use in an inflammatory way. It's a very accurate term according to international law. Why we call that Israel is practicing the crime of apartheid. And saying that Israel practices the crime of apartheid does not mean that Israel is identical to South Africa. It's not. There are many differences between Israel and South Africa, which I won't bore you with, but there are many similarities. Regardless, it's irrelevant. To say Israel is practicing apartheid, it's irrelevant to prove that it's identical to South Africa. What you have to show is that Israel has a system, a legal system of discrimination between two parts of the population based on racial criteria, religious, ethnic, and so on. The Russell Tribunal on Palestine, in its recent session in Cape Town, reached the conclusion that Israel's rule over the Palestinian people, wherever they reside, collectively amounts to a single integrated regime of apartheid. This means Israel is practicing apartheid not just against the Palestinians in the occupied territories, and that's obvious. They have roads for Jewish settlers and roads for Palestinians. They have housing for Jewish settlers separate from, and so on. Inside Israel itself, Israel has dozens of racist laws that discriminate against its so-called non-Jewish population, the indigenous Palestinians. From land ownership to jobs to many, many vital domains of life, there's legal discrimination against the Palestinian population. A South African Christian document in response to a Palestinian document, which I'll talk about later, had this very interesting quote. From our own experience with apartheid, we can clearly and without equivocation say that the Palestinian situation is in essence the same as apartheid, and it's in its practical manifestation even worse than South African apartheid. And as Edward Said famously said, it's equality or nothing. There's nothing more basic in international law than equality. Even ending the occupation is not as legally solid as ending inequality. There's nothing as profound as the right to equality. It's the first item in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's the very foundation of international law, that people deserve equal rights. So when we say that Israel has dozens of laws that prevent equality, this is a very serious issue that we have to consider. One manifestation of this discrimination is in land ownership. The Israeli state controls 93% of the land, and through very devious mechanisms, including the Jewish National Fund's control within that realm of land ownership, Palestinians are prevented from buying, renting, or living on 93% of the land of Israel. So 93% is for the Jewish citizens only, and in fact for any Jewish person. Any one of you who's Jewish in this room can go to Israel tomorrow and claim to, and can become a national immediately, a citizen, and can own land, whereas my wife, who was born in Israel, whose family was born in Israel, but she's the wrong type, she's Palestinian, cannot, because she's the wrong type. This is what apartheid means. You're discriminated against by law. It's not just racist policy. You have racist policies in the Netherlands. Everywhere you have racism. You discriminate against blacks, against Moroccans, against Turkish, and so on. There's discrimination. However, it's not institutionalized by law. If somebody is a citizen, you can't say, only if you're Calvinist can you own land on 93% of Holland. If you're not Calvinist, God forbid, you can't. If you're Jewish or Muslim, ooh, it's scary. You can't own land. So it's only for a certain part of the population. That's what Israel has. One manifestation is how houses of prayer were abused by Israeli settlers since 1948. This Catholic church in Ma'lul, a village in the Galilee, was used as a cattle shed until 2005. From 1948 to 2005. This mosque in Ain Hod, a village again near Haifa in the Galilee, was less lucky. It became a restaurant serving alcohol and so on, and it could never be retrieved by the Muslim community to be a mosque. And Araqib a Bedouin village in the Naqab or Negev desert, which was destroyed literally dozens of times by the Israeli forces, and it was rebuilt by its own owners, and with a lot of solidarity from progressive Israelis, from internationals, and every time the bulldozers go back in and destroy it. So the sign says, we are steadfast here, that we'll continue rebuilding, we're not moving off our land. An aspect of the Nakba and of the dispossession that's not talked about is destroying Palestinian books. Thanks to a Jewish Israeli researcher at Ben Gurion University, we now know that during the Nakba, during the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians around 1948, Israel collected, stole tens of thousands of books from private and public Palestinian libraries and systematically destroyed them. Tens of thousands of books were destroyed. Many thousands others were kept and are still kept in Israeli universities, in the libraries of Israeli universities, pillaged property, pillaged books. But for Israelis to destroy tens of thousands of books was a real irony of history. Overall, they can get away with this because they view us as less human, as relative humans, humans only in the relative sense. And it's a term I use to say that if you're not a full human, you're not entitled to the full set of human rights. You're a relative human, so you can get some rights, but not everything. So, why would you need books if you're a relative human? And of course, the third right, so we talked about ending occupation, ending apartheid inside Israel. The third and most important is denying the refugees the right to return, simply because they're the wrong type. Because as I said, any Jewish person anywhere in the world can go to Israel and become a national. And I have to explain this distinction between national and citizen. Israel is the only country on earth that has this two-tiered legal system. You can be a citizen, but not a national. If you're not Jewish, you can never become a national of the state. Israel is not a state of its citizens. It's a state of, quote, the Jewish people. So it doesn't even claim to be a state of its citizens. Any Jewish person in the world can become an Israeli national. A Palestinian born in Israel cannot become a national. He or she can only become a citizen, but not a national. And rights are allocated according to your nationality. So on Ina's and my Israeli IDs, there's a nationality item, and Ina cannot go to the court and ask for this to say Israeli. She would be defined as Jewish. Some progressive Israelis actually did go to court and tried to change it from Jewish to Israeli. The Supreme Court rejected it. Because if the Supreme Court would accept the nationality Israeli, it would end discrimination. Then Jew and Arab become equal. And that's the last thing Israel needs. So that's not on the books of the Interior Ministry. There's no such thing as Israeli nationality. It doesn't exist. Israel recognizes 130 plus nationalities, but Israeli is not one of them. Now moving to why should you care? You have enough problems in the Netherlands, there are enough problems in the Western world. Why should you even care about Palestine, about what Israel is doing? There are many points why you should care. Ethical, legal, but also political. Let me just give a figure, not directly related to the Netherlands, but the US. A recent study at Brown University showed that the US spent $4 trillion so far on its war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan since 2001. 4 trillion. Can you imagine what this figure can mean in terms of development and jobs and health and education and so on? Now, I don't know the figure in the Netherlands, how much was spent on war. Of course, much less. The Netherlands is a much smaller economy than the US. But relatively speaking, you can imagine how much money is spent on wars, on complicity in wars, on allowing Israel's system of oppression to continue when people are losing jobs, are losing job security, and healthcare and services in general are deteriorating in the Netherlands and across the Western world. And we all know what this money had done in those countries that the US was liberating and introducing democracy to. And another manifestation of that money well invested. But as Desmond Tutu says, the Israeli government is placed on a pedestal in the US and in the West in general, and to criticize it is to be immediately dubbed anti-Semitic, as if the Palestinians were not Semitic. People are scared in this country, here it refers to the US, to say wrong is wrong. And I think it applies just as equally to the Netherlands. But silence is not an option, because it's complicity. So why should you care? You should care, A, because your government is entirely complicit in Israel's violations of human rights and international law. You can't get off the hook because your government is semi-democratically elected, relatively speaking. I mean, compared to Pakistan, you have a better democracy, but only compared to Pakistan. So because you have a democratically elected government, there's a responsibility for the citizens of this country. When your tax money goes to oppress us, when your tax money enables Israel to continue its violations of human rights, you are complicit. So you have to take action to end complicity. We're not asking you for something heroic. We're not saying, come and demonstrate with us against the wall and against the settlements. That's for the more active of you, who are really into international solidarity and activism. But for every single citizen, average citizen of the Netherlands, at a more profound level, there's a moral obligation to end your complicity. Ending complicity. I don't want my money to be used to oppress people and violate human rights. That's a more basic moral obligation. It's not heroic. But then you can say, well, okay, I'm convinced, it sounds great, but I'm interested in peace. I really want to pursue peace. But to us, the oppressed, what does that mean? It means absolutely nothing. Peace without justice is institutionalizing injustice. It's perpetuating slavery. And you cannot beautify injustice and make it look nicer like in the Oslo Accords. You know, we'll give the Palestinians some money from Europe and everything will be fine. No, it will not be fine. So the master becomes nicer and the slave is expected to play along and be happy. But the slavery continues. Well, as Desmond Tutu says, we do not want our chains comfortable. We want them removed. What Europe is doing now is making our chains comfortable. They're subsidizing Israel's occupation, helping the Palestinians survive despite the Israeli occupation, to make us continue living under occupation, basically. They're not helping us resist occupation. Absolutely not. That's why we call for BDS. And that's why our main inspiration for this came from international movements for freedom and justice, as the South African and the civil rights movement in the US, and also from Gandhi as well. But at a very basic level, the BDS movement is very rooted in Palestinian nonviolent resistance, Palestinian civil resistance, which you don't hear about from your media. But Palestinian nonviolent resistance has been going on for 100 years against settler colonialism and later occupation and ethnic cleansing in so many forms, including boycott. We've had a long history of using boycott as a weapon against our oppressors. As far back as 1933 in Jaffa, against the British mandate and the colonization of Palestine, there were mass demonstrations that also called for boycotts. And also artistic resistance, literary resistance, which is hardly ever spoken about in the Western mainstream. People don't know that many Palestinians resist in cultural means, not just political and not just legal, but also culture. And this is a demonstration from the first Intifada in 1987. Some of you might recognize some people in the front rows, Hanan Ashrawi, Gabi Baramki, and others. And of course, the great revolt, tax revolt in Beit Sahur during the first Intifada, when Palestinians in Beit Sahur refused to pay taxes to the military authorities. And they participated in the resistance in various forms, including middle-class women. And education itself became a form of resistance, because it was banned. During the first Intifada in 1987, a few months after the Intifada, Israel shut down all Palestinian universities. Soon after, Israel shut down all Palestinian schools, and a little bit after, Israel shut down all kindergartens were shut down because they were obviously a security threat. So education was criminalized. Palestinian universities like Birzeit were closed for 4 consecutive years. And we did not hear a lot of the liberal academics in the West complaining, who are now saying boycotting Israeli universities infringes academic freedom. But they never opened their mouths when entire universities were shut down by the Israeli occupation for years on end. When Palestinian school kids were held on the street with the crime of holding a textbook. You are not allowed to walk with a textbook. And now fast forward to the Arab Spring, the Arab popular revolutions that are spreading, or what I call a prelude to an Arab Renaissance, which was very inspired by the Palestinian civil resistance. And people may not know that, but in the Arab world, leaders of the revolutions in Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, and elsewhere always say that our main inspiration was Palestine. We always saw how Palestinian kids could face big Israeli tanks, and that really inspired us. And the Occupy movement around the world, from New York to Amsterdam to Johannesburg to everywhere, which was very inspired by the Arab Spring as well, there's an awakening that's happened of the 99%, so to speak, the majority of the people who have no interest in perpetual wars and pillage, imperial hegemony, and so on, who have real interest in setting a social agenda, economic justice, freedoms, rights, sustainable jobs, saving the environment, and so on. And we're right at the center of that movement. Palestine has become right at the center of that global agenda for freedom and justice, especially social justice. Israel, on the other hand, is at the very core of the 1% agenda of perpetual wars. If you're in the arms industry, Israel is very good for business. Every few years, it starts a war, and it tests your weapons and shows them in the field how effective they are. So that's very good business for the weapons industry, for the homeland security industry, and all the industries related to continuing wars and oppression. So in Palestine, we raised the slogan, Occupy Wall Street, not Palestine. And Nelson Mandela said something that's very interesting. We can easily be enticed to read reconciliation and fairness as meaning parity between justice and injustice. Some people might say, okay, I'm convinced, but I want to be balanced. I want to support Palestine as well as Israel. What does that mean? Let's put it in context here. Imagine somebody back in the 1800s in the US would say, I support the US, but I'm against slavery. Otherwise, the US is a wonderful country. Or somebody in the 1980s in South Africa would have said, I support South Africa, but I don't like this apartheid bit. But otherwise, South Africa is wonderful. It would sound ridiculous, but in Israel, it's always said, and it doesn't sound ridiculous. People are used to saying that. I support Israel, but I'm against the occupation. I want to make that distinction. I'm not against Israel, I'm against the occupation. As if this occupation is an external entity on its own. As if it's not Israel that's committing the occupation. Even if you're not concerned about the basic rights of 2/3 of the Palestinian people who are not under occupation. Even if all you care about are the rights of the Palestinians under occupation, the 38%, you would boycott Israel because it's the one committing the occupation and building the colonies, the settlements, and so on. It's not an external entity.